You live on land, bound by asphalt, borders, and bureaucracy. You pay taxes for roads you don't drive on and obey laws made by people you've never met. But what if there was an escape? Not to the mountains, not to the desert, but to the one place on earth that has no master, no government, and no laws: the open, international ocean. This is the utopian fantasy that captured the minds of a generation of radical thinkers, engineers, and billionaires. This is the forgotten history of seasteading, the ambition to build the floating city. They weren't proposing glorified cruise ships, they were designing massive, stable, self-sufficient nations built on colossal, reinforced concrete platforms, anchored thousands of miles from shore, a refuge for innovation, unburdened by moral codes or regulatory friction, a place where you could build a radical new society from scratch, where money flowed freely, and politics ceased to exist. The blueprints were stunning. They showed multi-story towers rising from the turquoise sea, solar farms catching the limitless sun, and underwater greenhouses feeding a population of pioneers. It was the absolute zenith of engineering brilliance, an answer to the world's overpopulation and overgovernance problem. The money was ready. The engineers had solved every problem of static load and buoyancy. They had calculated the weight of every hydroponic farm and every luxury apartment. They were mere months away from laying the first concrete keel in the early 2000s, promising the dawn of a new civilization. But the ocean has a profound hatred for human arrogance. The engineers saw the sea as a blank canvas for freedom. The sea saw them as a fatal flaw in its chaotic design. They had solved the problem of staying afloat, but they had fatally ignored the problem of staying alive when the true antagonist, the forces of nature and the fury of international law, came calling. This dream didn't die because of a technical glitch. It died because the engineers, in their brilliance, made three catastrophic assumptions about the world they were trying to escape, and the most terrifying of those assumptions involved a secret, underwater geological time bomb they failed to map. The floating city wasn't an architect's whim, it was a philosophical necessity born from decades of disappointment. The 20th century promised a perfect world, yet delivered only bureaucratic expansion, tax hikes, and endless regulatory capture. This gave rise to the seasteading movement, founded on the core belief that, if you want to build a better world, you have to build a new place. The pioneers were driven by the concept of competitive governance. If people could choose their government by literally sailing to another platform, governments would be forced to innovate, improve, and compete for citizens. It was a radical libertarian fantasy married to Silicon Valley's faith in engineering solutions. The key figure was a man named Patrick Friedman, son of Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who co-founded the Seasteading Institute. He believed the ocean represented a virgin market for social structures. His team wasn't composed of hippies, they were PhDs from MIT and Stanford, funded by tech titans who wanted a testing ground for everything from new medical procedures to unregulated financial markets. They imagined a startup country on the water. The initial designs were simple: converted oil rigs or discarded naval vessels, but the dreams quickly escalated to skyscrapers, massive, modular concrete rectangles, interconnected like giant, floating Lego blocks. Designed to resist the forces of a Category 5 hurricane, they meticulously calculated the required ballast tanks, semi-submersible hulls, and dynamic positioning systems. The engineering was sublime. The core vision was an entirely new, stable, and ethical home. They had secured the political backing, the engineering blueprints were sound, and the money was flowing. All the variables seemed under human control, but the pioneers forgot that the most dangerous place on the planet isn't a corrupt boardroom. It's the 100-meter thick zone where air, water, and life violently collide, and that zone holds a secret enemy far worse than any storm. The height of the ambition was the actual breathtaking design architecture. The city wasn't supposed to float like a boat, it was designed to float like a modern offshore oil platform. This principle is called spar buoyancy. Below the surface, the structure plunges hundreds of feet deep, using the difference in wave motion between the surface and the deep to maintain stability. The surface might rock 5 degrees, but the deep structure acts as a massive dampener. You wouldn't feel seasick. You'd feel a slight, imperceptible hum. The infrastructure was a marvel of circular engineering. Power was to be generated by ocean thermal energy conversion, OTC, using the massive temperature differential between the warm surface water and the cold abyssal water. This system was designed to provide clean energy not just to the city, but potentially to export back to mainland nations. Waste would be entirely recycled, and food grown in vertical hydroponic farms. They had achieved a technological singularity of self-sufficiency, but the ocean is corrosive. The greatest technical failure lay in a simple material science problem: biofouling and corrosion. The immense concrete hull, which was supposed to last 100 years, would rapidly be attacked by salt, barnacles, and aggressive marine life. The cost of maintaining the hull, scraping and repainting the underwater structure every few years in the middle of a violent ocean, wasn't calculated as a periodic cost. It was an exponential, terminal cost. The maintenance budget alone exceeded the annual GDP of several small nations. The engineers could solve stability and power, but the constant battle against rust and barnacles revealed the true cost of their freedom. However, the final, fatal blow didn't come from a barnacle or a broken generator. It came from a betrayal in the halls of global power and an invisible piece of legislation that was specifically designed to kill the entire concept of a nation on the sea. The ultimate nemesis of the floating city was not water, it was law. The seasteaders needed a place to build and operate. They could not start in international waters immediately, as they needed logistical support from a nearby coast. They secured a memorandum of understanding with a small Pacific nation, let's call it Nation X, to operate in its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. About 12 miles from the coast, Nation X would receive tax revenue, and the seasteaders would receive regulatory freedom. This deal immediately triggered alarm bells in global capitals. Governments feared a successful, startup country would lead to capital flight, billionaires simply moving their assets and corporations offshore to escape taxes and regulations. The potential for the floating city to become a hub for untaxed money, dark finance, and human trafficking, unregulated medical procedures, etc., was deemed an intolerable risk by established powers. Political pressure was immense. Nation X was threatened with losing foreign aid and access to global banking systems if it proceeded. The deal fell apart, and the seasteaders were left with a colossal, uninsurable platform and nowhere to anchor it. They tried to move the project into international waters, but the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, a treaty that dictates everything about the ocean, had a quiet but absolute clause: no vessel, no matter how large, can claim sovereignty on the high seas without being universally recognized as a sovereign state, which requires a permanent population and defined territory. The floating city was legally nothing more than a giant boat. The world had effectively used legislation to betray the dream. The dream of freedom died not on the waves, but in a lawyer's office. The money ran dry, the political window closed, and the utopian concepts were shelved. Yet, the technology and architectural brilliance didn't vanish entirely. It was quietly absorbed into a different, more cynical global industry, and its failure taught us the most crucial lesson about the intersection of wealth, freedom, and climate change. The floating city did not create a new nation, but it fundamentally changed global industries. The advanced stability and power generation concepts developed for seasteading are now integral to modern floating LNG terminals and new generations of mega cruise ships, which must remain stable even in extreme conditions. The dream was commercialized and stripped of its philosophical ambition. We are now seeing a resurgence of floating city concepts, but for a different reason: climate change. Architects are now designing floating, resilient communities not to escape taxes, but to survive rising sea levels. The lessons of the seasteading failure. the cost of corrosion, the political difficulty of operating outside sovereign control, and the need for extreme stability, are now the blueprints for survival. The floating utopia failed because its founders sought to eliminate the fundamental human challenge, governance. They believed technology and money could buy them freedom from the rules of man and the rules of physics, but the project proved that true resilience is not about building a perfectly insulated bubble. It's about learning to cooperate within the complex, corrosive environment of the real world. You cannot escape society, even if you sail 200 miles from shore. The failure of the floating city asks a crucial question about the future. If rising sea levels force us to build floating habitats, should those new cities be granted full sovereign power, or should they remain under the control of existing nations? Where do you draw the line between freedom and global stability? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This was Never Built. We'll see you next time as we dive deep into another lost future.